1 minus g naught naught of x 1 to the power half. But because the clock is placed at x1, delta tau 1 is the intrinsic period of the clock, which is delta tau. Okay, so delta tau 1 is the same as delta tau. Is this point clear? Okay. We place the clock at x1. Okay. So the clock is ticking. Okay. And because the clock is placed at x1, okay, the delta tau 1, okay, the time, that proper time that will be elapsed at x1, okay, will be given exactly by the period of the clock, which is delta tau.
So what is delta x naught?
Pardon?
Delta x naught? What is
Yeah. So delta x naught is the interval that it looks in the x naught coordinate system. Okay. This is a mathematical object, okay, which tells you that in the x naught coordinate system, between two successive clicks, okay, what is the x naught value between two successive clicks on the top of the clock. Is this okay? Yes.
Each of these quantities corresponds to the notion of physical time, like the measured time. Is it delta tau or is it delta x?
Delta tau. If the clock is sitting at a, so proper time is always the unit in terms of which you measure things, right? So if we are sitting at x1 and if you are measuring time, right, you will be measuring delta tau. You will not know anything about x naught, right? Because an observer sitting at a given point always measures everything in terms of his or her proper time.
Sir, outside observer will see that delta x naught.
Well, we'll see what delta x naught corresponds to and who sees delta x naught. Okay. Right now, delta x naught is just a mathematical object, okay, which simply tells you how this gets translated to the x naught interval between two successive ticks, right? So these are two successive space-time events, right? The clock ticks first and then it ticks the second time, right? The value of x naught, so both happen at the same point x1 in the space point. Okay. But the difference in the value of x naught between these two successive ticks is given by this formula. Okay. You had some questions?
So this first line is coming from this equation. G00 x dx.
Yes, that's right. So it's coming from here.
There will be a minus one.
So minus and I have put here. Minus G00 because
Power minus half.
Oh, yeah.
minus half. Thanks. Yes, yes.
And now can you repeat the second line?
This line? Okay. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, so this we understand, right? Okay. So okay. So this one follows from this here. Okay. I have put a clock at x1. Right. You can forget about the first line. Okay. It's the first line basically follows from this. So I have put a clock at x1. Okay. I am saying that let's consider two successive ticks of that clock. Okay. That is measured in the proper time of the observer, which is at x1, is delta tau 1, that's by definition. But this delta tau 1 is the same as delta tau, the intrinsic period of the clock. Okay. And then this is delta x naught that has elapsed, okay, in x naught coordinate system between these two events. Right? A clock sitting at x1, right, ticking once and then next time. Okay, the interval between these two ticks. Okay, these are two space-time events, right? Both are happening sitting at x1, but at different x naught values. Right? How much is the difference in the x naught values between these two events? Okay. That is delta x naught. Okay. And we get this relation from this equation over here. Okay. This tells us the relationship between the difference in tau interval and the difference in x naught interval.
So in the when we say that time independent, that it means independent of x0, but tau is independent.
See, g is independent of x0. Right? So g naught naught, that's why I have written only x1. Right? But a clock sitting at a given point, of course its time is flowing. Right? So that is the, so x naught is changing, right, for that clock. But is that the g naught naught you have assumed to be independent of x naught. Okay, now we have this point x1, it emits the signal. Okay, at a certain time the clock has ticked. That signal is captured by the point at x2. Okay. Now it emits another signal later after a time delta x naught. That signal will be captured at x2 okay, exactly after delta x naught interval. Okay, why? Because since the metric is time independent, the x naught interval that it takes for the first signal to travel from here to here, is the same as the x naught interval that it will take for the second signal to travel from here to here. Is this point clear? Then because the light travels from x1 to x2, okay, according to certain rules, right? That rule is that it travels along a null geodesy. Okay, g mu nu dx nu equal to 0. You can solve for that equation, but it's not relevant here because all you are trying to argue is that the first signal will reach, if it's emitted at a point x naught, at time x naught, it will reach here at a time x naught prime. Okay, after a certain interval, x naught prime is x naught plus some interval that you can calculate in principle. But the second signal will reach exactly after the same amount of time. Okay, because the background is static. Is this clear?
Delta x naught is at same point or no other point? Delta x naught.
Yeah, delta x naught is an interval in x naught, right? So what you are saying is, see here, let's assume that the two signals are emitted at x naught 1 and x tilde naught 1. Okay, this is the emission, first emission, this is second emission. Now, given x naught 1, this will receive the signal after a certain time. Okay, so let's call this, suppose the light travels from here to here, okay, according to certain laws which you can get by solving null geodesy condition. So it will be given by x naught 1 plus some constant c. Okay, c is something that you can calculate. That's the time when this signal will reach this. Okay, that's what defines c. Now I am saying that if the signal now starts at the time x tilde naught 1, it will reach at a time x tilde naught 1 plus c, the same constant. Because this constant c depends on the metric that is in the intervening region. Okay, that the light follows along a geodesy. Since the metric is not depending on time, g mu nu is x naught independent. So the equation that we will solve to find how light travels from x naught 1 to from x1 to x2 starting at x naught 1 is the same equation that we will be solving to see how light travels if it starts at x tilde naught 1. And all that has happened is that the initial condition has gotten shifted, that instead of starting at x naught 1, it is starting at x tilde naught 1. Okay, but nothing else in the differential equation has gotten shifted, right? Because g mu nu which enters the differential equation is the same. So this constant is the same. So which basically means that if we take x tilde naught 1 minus x naught 1, which is what we are calling delta x naught, that will be the same as x tilde naught 1 plus c minus x naught 1 plus c, which is the same as delta x naught. Is this clear? So it's the same delta x naught, that will be the interval of x naught in which x2 receives the signal. But now we have to convert this into proper time of the observer sitting at x2. Is this clear? Okay, two successive signals are reaching us. Okay, that we are seeing that they are ticking of the clock. But now let's see what it feels like, okay, as measured in the proper time of the observer sitting at x2. Why is it relevant? Because the clock that the observer and x2 is carrying, okay, is clicking according to its proper time. Right? It will click at an interval of delta tau in the proper time of that observer. So delta tau 2, so delta x naught, okay, the same equation will now relate delta tau 2 times minus g naught naught of x2 to the power minus half. So delta tau 2 is the difference in proper time between two successive receipt of the signal. So now you can combine this to see that delta tau 2 is given by g naught naught x1 over g naught naught x2 to the power minus half. where this is the same. This is the same delta now.
Sir, those atomic clock,
Yes.
their proper time is same.
Yes, exactly. So they are in proper time, they are ticking, will be at exactly the same proper time interval. Right? So the clock that this observer at x2 is carrying, right, it will click at an interval of delta tau.
And it will also equate in x at point x1.
Yes, so that's the same as delta tau that we had here.
Hmm.
But what you are calculating here, delta tau 2, is not the interval at which the clock at x2 ticks. This is the interval that the clock at x2, that the observer at x2, forget about its clock, the observer at x2 will receive two successive signals from x1 separated by two successive clicking of the clock. That two successive clicking will appear as if they are occurring at a proper time interval of delta tau 2 from the point of view of the observer at 2. Okay. So this delta tau 2 is the interval that the observer at 2 will see if he or she looks at the clock that is placed at x1. The clock that is sitting at x2 will still continue to tick at an interval of delta tau. But sitting at x2, I want to look at x1, the clock at x1. The first time it clicks, it sends a signal. Second time it clicks, it sends another signal. Those two signals will appear to be separated by proper time interval delta tau 2 from the point of view of the observer at x2.
Sir. But previously you said that it will take same difference time it will see here.
In x0 coordinate. Yes.
Same difference.
In x0 coordinate, yes. So that's why this delta x0 is the same as this delta x0.
So sir, delta tau is a two different time between two different things.
Yes, exactly. But this is the proper time difference between two different ticks. This is the time difference, x0 time difference between two different ticks. Right? So the x0 time difference and the proper time difference are different, right? That's why we have this factor. So in the x0 coordinate system, right? See, x0 is the global time coordinate system, right? That you have chosen. When you write down all the differential equations or the null geodesic equation, it will be in the x0 coordinate system.
These two are not examined the same coordinate system.
No, delta tau 2 and x0 are not the same, right? Because they are related by this factor. Right? So in the x0 variable, the time interval that you see here is exactly the same as the time interval that you see here. But if you are carrying a clock, right, that clock knows nothing about x0. Right? That clock will tick according to its proper time. Okay? That is tau. So that proper time is related to x0 in one way here and in a different way here. Right? Because this g naught naught, it's in the x0 independent, but it's dependent on the space coordinates. So if these two are separated in space, then the relationship between the proper time and the actual x0 time will be different in these two different points. Right? And that's what gives rise to this difference over here. Is this okay? So the point is you have to distinguish between these two different times. x0 is some time coordinate. It's useful because in x0 coordinate system, in this coordinate system, the metric is x0 independent. Okay? And that's why the x0 interval remains the same. Whether it's that if the signal starts at the interval of x0, delta x0 here, then they reach here with the same interval delta x0. Okay, measured in the x0 coordinate system. But when you translate that to proper time, if it was proper time delta tau here, it's not the same proper time here. Right? Because the relationship between delta x and delta x0 and proper time changes as you go from here to here. Okay, so this is the proper time that you will see. This is the, so what is the physical interpretation of delta tau 2? This is the proper time interval that the clock, that the observer 2 will see between two successive ticking of the clock sitting at x1. Is this okay? So let's try to see what it looks like in the weak field approximation. Right, in the weak field limit, we have seen that G naught naught you can write as eta naught naught plus H naught naught. Eta naught naught of course is -1, and H naught naught we identified as -2 times phi, where phi is the gravitational potential. Yeah, so C I am setting equal to 1 now. Okay, if you want, you can put a C square, 2 phi over C square. Okay, that was just, but for most of the analysis later I will set C equal to 1. So then delta tau 2 from this is given by, well, you can invert it and remove this minus sign. So 1 plus 2 phi x2 by C square over 1 plus 2 phi x1 by C square, okay, which is nearly 1 plus 1 over C square times phi x2. Okay, I have just taken phi to be small, phi over C square to be small. So and then expanded, but we have done a Taylor series expansion. Okay, and this is the first start of the Taylor series.
This weak field result is not obtainable from the Newtons.
Pardon?
This weak field result,
Yeah.
this is not also means obtainable from the Newton's.
No, because there is a 1 over C square sitting up in front. Right? So the Newton's law will always take the C goes to infinity. Right? So Newtonian gravity will not produce this. Right? You will only see this one in the Newtonian gravity. Okay. So suppose, so this means that if phi x2 is greater than phi x1, then delta tau 2, oh, I should have put delta tau 2 is larger than delta tau. This means that the clock at x1 will appear to run slower slower because it takes more time. Delta tau 2, right, is the apparent time that it takes for between two successive takes. It looks like that the actual interval in two successive takes from the point of view of the observer sitting at 2 appears to be larger than delta tau. See, the observer sitting at 2, okay, has the clock which ticks at interval delta tau, right, because you have the same clock. Okay. So that's the clock that the observer sitting at 2 will see. Right? That's the take. Okay, that's the unit of time. That fixes the unit of time from the point of view of the observer sitting at 2. But in the same unit, so you try to measure what's happening at 1. You will see that the clock that are sitting at 1 is taking longer time. Okay? By the time this clock has ticked, the other clock still hasn't ticked. Okay, because that interval will appear to be delta tau 1. So the example is that if you take, for example, you take the surface of a planet, right? Let's take a planet here. Imagine that you have a clock sitting here. another clock sitting far away in space. Then you know that the gravitational potential here is lower than the gravitational potential here. Right? Normally take this to be 0 and then this is negative. Okay. So this is our x1, this is our x2. So if you observe from x2, you will find that the clock at x1 is running slower. Is this clear? Okay, so this is what is called the gravitational redshift. Okay. Why redshift? Because if you look at the, instead of thinking of a clock, suppose you look at the frequency of some spectral line that is going out from here. Okay. The time period of the spectral line will appear to be larger, which means the frequency will appear to be smaller. Okay. So the spectrum will look more red. Right? It will be redshifted. Okay. So this is what is called the gravitational redshift. Okay. A source sitting at a region where the gravitational potential is strong negative, okay, will appear to be more red than a source sitting nearby. Is this clear? And this effect you cannot see in standard Newtonian gravity because there it involves 1 over c square. Right? So the standard Newtonian gravity, non-relativistic theory of gravity, corresponds to the c goes to infinity limit. Okay, and in that limit you will never see the effect of these terms.
Basically, in other words, even in Newtonian gravity, this 800 term doesn't exist.
800 term?
It doesn't exist.
Well, 800 does exist in the sense that even to show that you can get to the Newtonian limit, you needed this 800.
Yes, yes. The phi, the potential.
Yeah, phi is the potential because this c square got cancelled against some explicit c square which was coming up
Yes, yes.
in front. But here there is also an explicit c square. It's 1 plus there is a really 1 over c square sitting in front. And that's the reason why this term is small.
This is multiplicative factor, like tracing out, like how t tau 2 is slow, less will be, larger will be t tau. Can it be possible that anyway this delta t tau 2 can diverge to infinity?
And diverge to, well, to diverge to infinity you have to make this has to go to minus 1 or something, right? Okay, but that basically corresponds to taking g naught naught to 0. And that's a singular metric. Or it looks like a singular metric. It may happen sometimes that the metric is not really singular, right? It's a problem with the coordinate system.
At that point it will be.
Pardon?
At that point it is.
Yeah, then it's diverging, right? This delta, this ratio delta tau 2, that even if, so delta, for a finite delta tau, it will look like as if it takes infinite time. Right? That's called infinite redshift. Okay? If this ratio becomes infinite. And this is, as you will see, this is what happens at the surface of a black hole. Okay? The surface of a black hole is characterized by this quantity
Goes to 0.
well,
Phi.
yeah, x1 is sitting, yeah. So this quantity goes to 0. You see, this quantity essentially represents g naught naught of x1. Right? Or minus g naught naught of x1. So that goes to 0 on the surface of a black hole. And because of this, there is infinite redshift when you have a source sitting at the surface of the black hole. Okay, but we will see this later, okay, when you construct the black hole solution.
So we are considering the source to be x1.
x1, yes. Source is at x1. Okay. So if at x1, okay, you see that if this metric is such, so the x2 we always think of it looking at from far away, right? So there g naught naught is almost equal to eta naught. Okay, gravitational field has died down. But here there can be strong gravity, and if the gravity is sufficiently strong so that this denominator factor vanishes, okay, then this could diverge.
So that means that phi x1 should be greater than phi x2. Means we are considering.
So this is negative. So phi x2 is greater than phi x1. This is 0. Right? This is large and negative.
Oh, that's
Right? So you have to think of it that way, right? Magnitude wise, this is large. Okay? But with taking into account the sign, right? This is 0. This is large and negative.
In case of if someone wants to put the source at x1 and x2 and want to observe it from x1, then this will be a wavelength.
So that may look like a blue,
yeah,
blue shift.
Blue shift.
Yeah,
Blue
yeah.
shift.
Getting a metric as 0 implies a singularity.
Well, it's an apparent singularity of the metric, but it need not be a genuine singularity, right? Because it may be removable by coordinate transformation, and that's what happens for the black hole. The horizon of a black hole, right? This term does vanish, but there is a new coordinate system that you can write down in which the metric becomes non-singular.
So sir, but this blue shift and red shift are something physical, right?
Yes, that's something physical.
So what will actually happen in that?
Well, see, the point is that it's something physical, but you think of it, if you want to sit here, okay, there is strong gravitational pull, right? So if you want to sit static at x1, okay, you have to run an engine in the opposite direction, right? So what will happen is that in practice you cannot really sit on the surface of a black hole because you need infinite engine power to prevent the gravitational pull of the black hole. Okay, so what you can do is that you can have a very powerful engine and sit very close to the horizon, okay, and in which case the redshift will be large but not infinite.
Geodesic natures of null geodesic nature of the black hole will be different at the horizon.
Will be different in the sense that if you want to sit really at x1 static, right, then you really have to run the engine at a with a very high power.
So but all of a sudden if you do some coordinate transformation, then you are in a very good situation, right?
Yes, that is true. That is true. But in a very good situation, what will happen is that it looks like you are almost trying to travel at the speed of light.
Oh.
So you still have to apply very high engine power to remain static.
Okay.
Because the fact that you have to run an engine at a very high axle with a very high power, that's independent of coordinate choice, right? Because that force you can measure in your proper time, right? And the point is in the proper time of an observer that sits here static, the force has to be infinite, okay, the radial outward force, and then you can convert it to another coordinate system. Right? In that coordinate system, you will find that effectively you are trying to put an infinite acceleration. Okay, and hence that again requires infinite force. Are there any other questions?
So that frame is like moving with the velocity what? Near to C or C?
Well, it's that question really doesn't completely make sense in general relativity, right? Because you are making a general choice, make transformation of coordinates. Okay? But near the horizon, the two coordinate systems are related by a very high boost, right? Which basically means that one is moving almost at the speed of light relative to the other one. Okay? But the invariant way of saying this is that the coordinate transformation that takes you from the standard radial coordinate system to that coordinate system where the metric is non-singular, that coordinate transformation itself is singular near the horizon. Okay, that basically translates to this infinite boost, right, which corresponds to singular coordinate transformation. Yeah, any other question? But this, in any case, you will study in detail when you study black holes. Okay. Right now, think of this as a weak field effect. Okay. Even on the surface of the Earth, if we keep a source and if you observe from far, right, you will find that apparently the source has slowed down. Okay, its natural frequency. I mean, you know, for example, the spectral lines, right? Sodium lines, for example. Right? So the sodium lines, okay, if you observe from far, okay, the sodium light coming from the surface of the Earth, you will find that it's redshifted, right? It's the frequency of the sodium line is not what you are used to in laboratory measurement. Okay, because in laboratory measurement you are using the same proper time for the source as well as for the observer, right? Because you are all on the surface of the Earth. Compared to the laboratory measurement, you will find that the sodium spectral line, okay, if you measure it from here, and if the source is here, then it has gotten redshifted. It has wavelength that is larger than what you normally see in laboratory experiment.
Sir, I have a
Yes.
small question regarding these coordinate intervals actually.
Yes.
Like these intervals are not physical distances neither in the space coordinates nor in the time coordinates. These delta
X naught. No,
right?
no.
So my question was that supposedly like in terms of space coordinates, if you are having an Euclidean embedding, say you can establish a coordinate interval on a 2 sphere when you have it embedded in a Euclidean three-dimensional space.
Yes.
Suppose you don't have an embedding, how do you actually go about establishing xi's at every point on the manifold? How can you do that without an embedding?
Well, you can describe a manifold in an intrinsic way, right? I mean, the sphere, for example, you can coordinatize the sphere by theta and phi, right? And that description is independent of the embedding. Okay? You can say that you specify the metric on the two-dimensional sphere in terms of theta and phi, and theta takes certain range, phi takes certain range. There is some kind of identification. You specify the metric in terms of theta and phi. You don't need an embedding of this in three-dimensional space to introduce those coordinates. So it is not necessary that you have to embed it in a higher dimensional space. Right? Sometimes it is useful if you can embed it, but that's not necessary. And in most of Riemannian geometry that will come for general relativity, we will not try to embed it in some higher dimensional space. Okay? So the choice of coordinate system doesn't require that you have to embed it in a higher dimensional space. Any other question? Okay, so last time we derived the equation for the free particle. In fact, we said that the free particle moves along a geodesic, and that led to an equation of the following form.
So this redshift, regulation redshift can also happen when tau g is dependent on time.
Yes, it can happen also when G is dependent on time, but then the analysis is a little more complicated, because if you take two intervals, right, we said that if the first one, if the interval at which the signal is emitted is delta x naught, then we say that will be received at the same interval delta x naught at the point 2, right? And that relies on the fact that the geometry, the metric is not changing as a function of x naught, right? So it doesn't matter when you begin, right? The amount of the x naught that will elapse before it is received is always the same, right? If we start at x naught equal to 0 and reach the target at say x naught equal to 1 second, right? Then if you start with x naught equal to 50, then it will reach at 51 seconds. Okay? So that will not hold anymore. That is, the metric itself is time dependent. So then there will be an extra effect which has to be taken into account.
Question is asked because means when we take the spectrum of the stars, there the metric is dependent on time. At least not on the scales that we are considering.
Well, on the scales, if the star is not very far, okay, then the metric is not dependent on time. But when you look at the very far away stars, okay, where the time evolution is important, time evolution of the metric is important, yes, then they have to take correct for that. So then part of the redshift will come because of the star moving away from us. Part of it will come because of the expansion of the universe. Right? And both have to be taken into account. Okay. So this was the equation of motion for a free particle. Okay, and from this we say that this is this can be also regarded as the equivalence principle, because in the local inertial frame where gamma is 0, okay, this is exactly the equation of motion of a free particle that you see in the absence of gravity.
Del x nu delta.
Pardon?
Del x nu delta. Dx nu
Proper
delta.
tau. Thanks. So tau is the proper time. So now I have taken the affine parameter also normalized correctly. So it is proper time. So g mu nu dx mu tau. Now suppose that you are interested in studying how a particle behaves in the presence of a force acting on it. Okay? So what do we expect? We expect something on the other side. Right? In the presence of a force for a free particle, we know that if there is no gravity, it's d2x mu d tau square is equal to f2. So you expect that there should be something on the other side. Now how do we calculate that something on the other side? Okay, what is the principle that allows us to calculate what appears on the other side?
So if there is a force.
If there is a force, right? Suppose they have a particle carrying a force. Okay, how do you calculate the force, for example? Right? What is the basic principle? So here, again, we can try to use principle of equivalence. Okay, even though we have argued that the principle of equivalence is not universal, okay, nevertheless, it's good to very good accuracy. Okay, so to begin with, we can say that the principle of equivalence is the correct principle, okay, and see what we can expect.
In general relativity, we always assume that the principle of equivalence does hold.
No,
In
as I
Einstein's relativity.
said yesterday, last time,
Yeah.
right, that the principle of equivalence that you can study.
Yeah.
So there are two aspects here. One is general coordinate invariance, right? That is sacred. The principle of equivalence is not necessarily sacred, right? So it depends on what you mean by general relativity. Often general relativity refers to more general theories of gravity, right? Where you can allow for principle of equivalence to be violated, right? Quantum effects will eventually
Yes.
violate principle of equivalence.
But in Einstein's gravity,
As formulated originally by Einstein, yes, I mean it was based on principle of equivalence. Okay, but we will not give that too much importance. Okay, but we also know that it should hold to a very good accuracy because of the arguments that we said. That was simply the scale arguments. Okay, and we will come back to this again. Okay. But let's suppose that we try to use principle of equivalence to guess what this equation should look like. So then the principle of equivalence tells us that if we go to a frame in which gamma prime mu rho equal to 0 and say g prime mu nu is equal to eta mu nu, it's always the equation of motion should look like d2x prime mu d tau square is equal to f prime mu, where f prime mu is the force, expected force in absence of gravity. Okay, that should be the principle of equivalence. Yeah, because the laws of general relativity tells us that in local inertial frame, the equations of motion should look exactly as if we had no gravity. Right? And if we had no gravity, then this f prime mu should be calculated according to the same rule, okay, that we will use if there is no gravity. So to be more specific, right, what it means, that imagine that we have a rocket which you have tested in absence of gravity, and you know that certain amount of fuel in the rocket produces certain amount of acceleration. Okay? So now, if you want to see how that rocket will behave in the presence of gravity, what we will say is that the equations of motion should be such that in local inertial frame, the rule for calculating this f prime mu is that we simply use the same laws that govern how much fuel produces how much force. Okay? That in the local inertial frame, if you put exactly the same amount of fuel, you will get same amount of f prime. Okay? That will be the principle of equivalence. The rule for computing f prime mu shouldn't depend on whether you have gravity or not. Okay, so if you have tested your rocket in absence of gravity, you can work out how it will look like in the presence of gravity. Okay, but of course only in this very special local inertial frame. Is this point clear? Okay, so this will be the statement of principle of equivalence. If on the other hand, the force is produced not by an engine that you have, but suppose by some external field, electromagnetic field, then what it tells us is that this force has to be computed in this local inertial frame using exactly the same laws that we will calculate, that we will use to calculate the force due to an electromagnetic field
Flat.
in a flat space. Okay. In a different space, in the presence of gravity, okay, the laws will be different in general. Okay, we will see what they are. But in the absence of gravity, this will be the law. Is it okay? But of course, it's not useful, okay, or it's not very convenient to always look at the local inertial frame and look at the equation, right? Because as the particle is moving under this force, right, it goes to another point where this x prime coordinate is not local inertial frame, right? You have to keep changing your frames. Okay, if you really want to use this equation, right, every time the particle has moved a little bit, you have gone out of local inertial frame, right? So you have to change your coordinate system, apply this again and change your coordinate system, apply this again and so on. So what we would like is to write down a general equation that is valid in all coordinate systems. Okay? So how to do that? So let's suppose x is a general coordinate system. Now the left hand side, we know how to convert from the x prime coordinate to the x coordinate. Okay, in fact, we have done it in the context of free particle, right? When we were trying to derive the equation of a geodesy, okay? We started from this equal to 0 and rewrote this in terms of the x coordinate system. So in the general coordinate system, we know that d2 x prime mu d tau square is given by del mu x prime mu times d2 x mu d tau square gamma mu sigma Is this clear?
Can you repeat it actually?
Yeah, this quantity x prime d2 x prime mu d tau square, right? X prime is a function of x, right? So you can just rewrite this in terms of d2x d tau square and other things, right? And that will involve second derivative of x prime with respect to x, for example, right? Because the same analysis that we did to convert the parallel transport equation or the geodesic equation, right? We said that it's straight line in this spatial coordinate system, and from that we worked out that this is the correct equation in the general coordinate system. Okay? So the same analysis will tell us that d2 x prime mu d tau square is given by del mu x prime mu times this. Okay, if you look at the notes, it's exactly this that we will find. So left hand side is clear. But of course, this is equal to f prime, right? d2 x prime mu d tau square is equal to f prime. But then the equation can be written as del tau x prime mu del nu x prime mu and d2 x nu d tau square gamma mu equal to f prime. So you can simplify this by multiplying both sides by, let's see, del prime mu x alpha times this. Suppose you multiply del prime mu x alpha. Mu is a free index, so you can just contract. So this product just gives you delta nu alpha, right? So that converts this nu index to alpha index. So d2 x alpha tau square plus gamma alpha rho sigma x dx sigma, so now equal to del prime x alpha times f prime. Okay, f prime mu is calculated by that same rule that I said, right? That you work in absence of gravity, just work out what the force would be for a given amount of fuel, and that's the same f prime. That is.
Can't it be just written just from assuming that f prime mu is a vector in?
No, I'm not assuming any such thing. Okay, that's the point. That you cannot assume a transformation law arbitrarily, right? So at this stage, all I have said is that this is the rule, this is what principle of equivalence tells us. Now let's see what it gives us in a general coordinate system.
What was the question?
No, you are saying that you can try to get this by assuming that the f prime mu transforms as a vector, right? But you are not. I mean, we don't even know what it means, right? That how a certain thing transforms on a general coordinate transforms is not something given to us from the beginning, right? It's something that we have to determine.
Yes. From what we know.
Yeah, from say, in particular in this case, the equivalence principle. If we use the equivalence principle as a guide. So the idea now is that we define this. This is by definition. Define this to be f mu of x. Sorry, f alpha of x. So what this means that if somebody tells you how to calculate f alpha of x in a general coordinate system, you define it by first going back to the inertial coordinates, local inertial frame, then use the usual knowledge of fuel versus acceleration in the absence of gravity, calculate f prime mu, and then multiply f prime mu by del prime mu x alpha, okay, to define what you mean by f alpha of x. Okay. That's in fact the only way you know how to define f alpha x from what you have said. Okay. Otherwise, f alpha of x, there is no independent way of saying that what it means, right? How to calculate f alpha of x. Okay. What are the rules? Suppose I give some fuel. Okay. How to calculate how much f alpha of x will be? Right? The correct way to define it even is this, through this. In this case, we will define this to be f alpha of x. Okay, so that the equation looks simple: d2 x alpha d tau square plus gamma alpha rho sigma of x dx rho d tau dx sigma d tau f alpha of x.
As force is a vector, so this is always means.
But how do you know that force is a vector? Force is a vector in our normal flat space-time. We know what a vector means, and the force is a vector, right? It has three components. But when we are writing the equation in the presence of gravity, right? I mean, it's not clear what we mean by force is a vector, right?
But sir, we can say that on that equation, the left hand side is a vector.
Yes.
Then the right hand side also should.
Okay. So the point is, we know the right hand side will be some vector, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But then you have to understand what this vector, how to compute that vector. Right? And the way to compute that vector is always by using this, because the f prime is something that we can determine from equivalence principle. Right? And then this, of course, depends on the coordinate transformation. So you can say that f alpha is that whatever is on the right hand side should be a vector. Okay, should transform as a vector. Okay, it's not a vector because this need not be defined for every value of x, right? This is defined only on the trajectory. Right? If we have a rocket that is accelerated, right, by some engine, then there is no force field, right? That quantity is defined only on the trajectory of the particle. Okay? But yes, it transforms in a certain way. But what that quantity is, you can only define by this. Okay, so you, instead of saying from the beginning that it transforms in a certain way, you try to derive what this quantity is by following, by starting from the principle of equivalence. Okay, now given this, we can ask the following question. Then suppose x double prime is another general coordinate system. Then by following the same logic, okay, there is nothing special about x, so you can say that the equations in the x double prime coordinate will be d2x double prime alpha d tau square plus gamma double prime alpha rho sigma this should be f double prime alpha, and f double prime alpha will be given by del prime, that's called the mu x double prime alpha and f prime. Okay, so f double prime alpha is given here, f prime mu is given here, but f alpha is given here. Now it's an easy exercise to combine this, so let me write also other equation. F alpha is equal to del prime mu of x alpha times f prime mu. It's an easy exercise to show that f double prime alpha is del beta f double prime alpha times f beta. Okay, that you can basically eliminate f prime mu from these two equations by multiplying by appropriate factors, and we can directly relate f alpha and f double prime alpha, which is here. Okay, which is another way of saying that this indeed transforms like a vector. Okay, but the fact that it transforms like a vector follows from its definition. Okay, you don't have to make that as a separate postulate. Once you have defined this to be f alpha, then you can take another general coordinate system for which you can define f double prime alpha, and the relation between the two just follows from these two definitions. Is this okay?
Nevertheless, if say we have a force which is a function of x, yes, we have to evaluate the function at every point. So this that.
Yes, so every point, the point is that if you know how to calculate an inertial frame, you have to relate x to x prime at every point, okay, and use that to find f alpha in terms of f prime alpha. Okay. F prime alpha is something that you can calculate directly. Okay. That's what will come out.
That is at one point.
No, every point. For take any point x. Take any point x. Okay. At that point, you can. We have an x prime coordinate system. Right. So you know what x is in terms of x prime at that point. right? Then suppose the trajectory is passing through this, right? Otherwise it doesn't make sense to take that point. Then we can relate f in terms of f prime at that point, right? And then you calculate f prime using the laws that governs the force in terms of your input like fuel in the absence of gravity. Right? So on any point on the trajectory, if you want to actually calculate the force, you have to make that transformation, right? Or at least you have to do something that is equivalent to that. Right? I am not saying that you always have to go back to x prime coordinate system and calculate this. You may find a better way to calculate this f alpha. But the principle is this, that in the local inertial frame, okay, the calculation should reduce to the calculation in the absence of gravity. Right? If you want to calculate the force, you just forget about gravity, calculate the force, and in terms of this, you can define how much force there will be in a general coordinate system using this formula. Is this okay? Okay, now we'll consider a slightly different situation where the force is external, okay, which basically means, let's imagine that there is an electromagnetic field, okay, and the particle carries a charge and it's feeling the force because of the presence of the electromagnetic field. Okay. In this case, the force is not particularly attached to the particle, right? For any trajectory, you can now calculate what the equation should be. The principle should again be the same. Okay. In fact, in the presence of gravity, to begin with, we don't even know what electromagnetic field means, right? How to describe electromagnetic field. Okay, that is something you have to learn, how to describe electromagnetic field in the presence of gravity. So what we will do is that we will take a given trajectory. At any given point, we can make a change of coordinates so that we go to local inertial frame. In that local inertial frame, we will demand that the motion of electric and magnetic field should be exactly as if there is no gravity, okay, and the force on the particle should be exactly as if there is no gravity. Okay, the force law that will have to follow in that frame is according to the laws of electromagnetism. Is this clear? Okay. So then first let's study the force law in electromagnetism in the absence of gravity. Okay. That's the Lorentz force. Okay, that's the electrostatic force and the force due to magnetic field. And in absence of gravity, the force law, the laws of Boltzmann takes the following form. So here I am going to use a covariant notation. Okay, what we will see if Q eta mu nu is 0, okay, this is in the C equal to 1. What is F mu nu? So F nu rho is del nu A rho minus del nu A nu. So A basically is A0, A1, A2, A3 is the electromagnetic is the vector potential. In fact, the more precise this thing is that this is minus phi. I have used phi before, that's the minus V is the electrostatic potential. And this is vector potential. Is this familiar? This way of writing the force law? Okay, maybe I can just say a few words about how it's related to the usual way. So basically the relationship is that the components of the electric field EI is minus F0I. So minus F0I according to this will be del I A0 minus del 0 AI, which translates to E equal to minus grad phi minus del A del. This is the familiar expression for electric field in terms of the vector, the scalar potential and the electromagnetism. Right? So EI, that's the definition. EI is given by this. BI, okay, this in fact you can write as half sum over J and K, equal to 1 to 3 epsilon I J K H J K. Epsilon ijk is probably antisymmetric tensor with epsilon 1 to 3 being equal to 1. In components, we write B1 is equal to F del 2A3 minus del 2A2, B2 is equal to del 3A1 minus del 1A2, and B3 is del 1A2 minus del 0 Okay, so this basically together gives a B is equal to curl of A. Okay, these three equations together is accepted, and B is curl of A. Is this okay? Okay, so I'm just making connection between the mu nu and the E and B. Okay, the covariant notation to the non-covariant notation, the usual vector notation. Okay. And then what you want to see is that this becomes the Lorentz force law. Okay, in terms of these variables. So let's look at the mu equal to I case. Okay, so that's the only case we need to look at. So for mu equal to I case, I can write this equation as dB tau of m dxi beta this is q so eta mu is I, so mu has to be j. Eta I j. And then you have a f j rho dx rho d tau. F j rho dx rho d tau.
Isn't that the I?
Pardon?
I, that is the I.
Yeah, but if eta I j is delta I j, so I can replace this by I.
Yes.
Okay, but let's keep it as it is for now. So this becomes q. Okay, now I can replace j by I. So q times f I. So j has become I. Rho can be either 0 or k. Okay. So f I 0 dx 0 beta plus f I k dx k. This sum over k is now running from 1 to 3. Now what is fi0? fi0 is E, right?
Minus
This
E.
here is minus f0i, which is the same as fi0, right? F is antisymmetric in 2 index. So this is q times pi. Q times Ci, which you see the familiar electrostatic force. If Ik, you can actually write F epsilon IK will be there. F12 is B3. You can see from here, right? F12 is B3. Okay. F23 is B1. F31 is B2. So this thing becomes epsilon IKL dxk d tau BL. Okay? Pardon? Well, almost, but not quite. Now you see this is Pi. This is by definition momentum. Okay? So we are almost there, except that normally when you write the Lorentz force law in the non-covariant notation, you use dpi dt, not dpi d tau. Okay? So dpi d tau, then this the right hand side I can write as dpi dt times dt d tau. Okay, which is the same as dx naught d tau, because I have set c equal to 1, so x naught and t are the same. Here is the dx naught d tau.
Del pi del t, no,
No, now I am thinking of everything as a function of t, right? Here everything as a function of tau. Now all I am saying is let's imagine that the tau has been eliminated in favor of t, and you express everything else in terms of t. Okay? That's the way you normally describe a non-relativistic trajectory. Right? When you are using non-relativistic physics, you think of everything as a function of time. Right? That's the, because we want to go to that picture, because that's the in that picture we know the Lorentz force law. So this is dpi dt times dx naught d tau. There is already dx naught d tau here, okay, factored. This one I will write as dxk dt times dt d tau, okay, which is the same as dx naught d tau. So dx naught d tau then is common between left hand side and right hand side. Every term has a dx naught d tau factor which you can eliminate. So then the next term you can easily check becomes Q. So this so let me write down a factor of dx naught d tau. Yes, go ahead.
So eta is there.
Yeah. So the point is, because you are doing it in flat space time,
Okay,
right? For eta ij, the contravariant and covariant makes no difference, right? Because eta ij is delta ij. So for the raising and lowering index, right, makes no difference. For 0, it's a little. I mean, you have to be a little careful, because when you raise a 0 up, you get a minus sign, right? But as far as the ij index is concerned, there is no sign.
In our convention.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter exactly in our convention, so it doesn't matter where you write the index. So this is QEI plus. So this is, here you have Q. Q let me take out. You see, epsilon IKL, now it has become dxk dt, because this term we have taken out. That's dk times BL. Okay, that's nothing but V cross B. So V cross B. I. Okay, this is exactly the Lorentz force law. Okay, dpi dt. So you get, let me write once here, dpi dt. But here I upper or lower makes no difference. E is Q times Pi times P plus B. So this is just to show that the form that this 4-dimensional form that we wrote down for the Lorentz force for the equations is indeed what corresponds to the usual Lorentz force that you are familiar with in electromagnetism. Okay, but now we'll go back to the 4-dimensional form, okay, and start from there.
Because I mean, we have my time variable now. Should it be dxi dt which is the momentum? It's m dxi dt which is
No, the point is in, if you look at electromagnetism, right, and if you really look at relativistic electromagnetism, then what appears on the right hand side is really dxi d tau, right?
p minus e.
Not, yeah, but P involves a gamma factor, right? When you can, if you write m dxi dt, right, then this m is related to the rest mass by the m over 1 over square root of v square minus omega factor, right? So this m here is a rest mass, right? That's why it's dxi d tau. Okay, so that true relativistic particle moving in a electromagnetic field will have, this is really the correct equation, dpi dt, right, where pi is defined with tau and not p. Okay, otherwise, as I said, we have to correct for m. I mean, instead of writing m as a rest mass, you would write it as m, the mass in the moving frame, right? Put in the gamma factor inside m. Okay, so in any case, so let me go back to the covariant form, the Lorentz covariant form. So we have m d2 x mu d tau square, m d2 x mu d tau square is q equal mu f mu rho dx tau with f mu rho given by So now we will start with principle of equivalence, which means that we will take the equations of motion in the presence of gravitational field to be given by this in the local inertial frame. Right? That will be the statement of principle of equivalence. So in local inertial frame, okay, this is our starting point. This f prime we know what it means. For example, if we want to measure the electric and magnetic field in this local inertial frame, we will do exactly the same experiment that we do to test electric and magnetic field in the absence of gravity. Right? That we will put a point particle, right, and measure the force on the point particle to calculate the electric charge, and we will take a point particle moving at a certain velocity and measure the force to find its magnetic charge, and those will define what we mean by f prime. Right? So this then completely defines what you mean by equations of motion in the presence of electromagnetic field. Right? What electromagnetic field corresponds to and what kind of force it exerts. But again, we now want to go back to the general coordinate system, which of course you know how to do, because once you know the equation of motion in one particular coordinate system, we can always go back from x prime to x. So we write the left hand side as before can be written as del mu x prime mu times d2 x mu d tau square as gamma mu rho sigma dx rho d tau right hand side, I can write as Q. Now, what the goal is that we will try to write express the right hand side in terms of unprimed variables. Okay, but of course for f prime we have no idea what unprimed variables are. Right, we don't even know how to measure it. Okay, but g prime we know what unprimed g is. Right, what g prime is in terms of g, and this also we can express in terms of unprimed variables because x prime is expressed in terms of x. So here I can write this as Q del alpha x prime nu
Q prime Q
del
by
beta x prime nu g alpha beta f prime mu nu f prime nu times dx del gamma x prime del and dx gamma theta. Is this okay?
Q by N.
Q by n. Or you can put a name. Now again, as before, we can get rid of this x prime. Okay, this is a factor, and the way to do it is just again multiplied by del prime mu of x. Let's see, have to use some symbol that is not there.
Delta.
X delta. So beta is there.
Yes.
X delta. So this will combine to give you a delta nu. So this nu will become delta. So d2 x delta d tau square plus gamma delta sigma dx square dx sigma equal to but these two together gives you a delta alpha delta, right? Okay. So I can just put the alpha by, replace the alpha by delta. Let's see that. This del beta g delta beta. Delta mu rho del gamma x prime rho dx gamma beta. Okay? Now what I am going to do is to define a new quantity f alpha beta. So this is definition, define f beta gamma equal to del beta x prime nu del gamma x prime rho f mu rho.
Fine. Sorry.
Right. If we define it this way, then this equation can be written right hand side of this equation, right here, as q by m T delta beta F beta gamma dx gamma beta. So you can think of this as a convenient definition of F beta gamma, right? We didn't know, there is no a priori definition of what we mean by electromagnetic field in a general coordinate system in the presence of gravity. Okay? But we knew what we mean by electromagnetic field in a local inertial frame, because it has exactly the same physics. You can measure the electromagnetic field by seeing how a charged particle behaves in that field. And now we are saying that we define the electromagnetic field in a general coordinate system by this equation over here. And in terms of that definition, the equation for a charged particle looks simple. That it's this quantity equal to this. Okay. Is this clear? Now I'll give it as an exercise to show that F prime nu rho rho is del prime nu a rho minus del prime rho a nu, right? We know the definition of F prime nu. This is del prime nu a prime rho minus del prime rho a prime nu. So using this, you show that F beta gamma can be written as del beta a gamma minus del gamma a beta, where a beta is del beta x prime nu Is this okay? Now suppose you use a defined coordinate system, not x coordinate system but x double prime, which is also a general coordinate system, okay, has no special property, okay, but it's a different from x. Then you can do exactly the same game, okay, and arrive at the conclusion that there is a corresponding a double prime beta will be given by del double prime beta x prime nu times a prime nu. And then we can combine these two informations to find the relationship between a double prime beta and a beta. A double prime beta will be del double prime beta a alpha x alpha times a alpha. Which basically says that while this definition of F beta gamma, okay, is the one chosen out of convenience so that we can write the equation in a simple way. Okay. But with that definition, okay, and the corresponding definition of A beta, okay, now we see that this A beta, okay, acts as a vector field, okay, or a tensor field of rank 0, 1. Okay. Its transformation laws are exactly as we had demanded for the transformation law of a vector field. Right? Earlier we had constructed those vector fields in terms of the metric. We had said that we will only consider tensor fields in terms of the metric. Okay. But now you see that the electromagnetic field, okay, or the electromagnetic vector potential transforms as a vector field exactly following the same spirit. Okay. Now this is to be distinguished from F mu, right? The F mu that we said, okay, somebody said transforms as a vector, okay, but that was not a vector field. Because in general F mu, okay, the force on the particle is defined only on the trajectory, and it doesn't make sense to talk about the force on a particle away from the trajectory, right? Suppose the force is because of some engine that is running, that is driving the particle, right? Obviously it has no meaning away from the trajectory. In contrast, this is a genuine vector field, right? This electromagnetic field that you have defined, right, is present in general, right? Now it may happen that if a particle move along a certain trajectory, then only the electromagnetic field along that trajectory is relevant. But you can always consider another particle moving on another trajectory, okay, and the electromagnetic field over that trajectory will affect the force on that. Okay. So this transformation law that you can see, that you have written down, you can see, is completely general, right? It doesn't depend on the trajectory as such. Yeah, it only depends on the transformation between x and x prime coordinate, x double prime coordinate system, right? Or this definition depends only on the transformation between the prime coordinates and the unprime coordinates. So A beta is a rank 0, 1 tensor, and you can easily check that F alpha beta is a rank 0, 2 tensor. Is this okay? So let me write the equation again. So the equation of a electronic particle in electromagnetic field will be given by Q over M times G delta beta F beta gamma dx gamma beta. So this is what you get from equivalence principle. Okay. The transformation laws of F etc. you have defined derived from equivalence principle. And now we can consider modifications of the equivalence principle, okay, without modifying the transformation laws of the fields. For example, we can add to this a term like this: Q over N R delta gamma gamma with some arbitrary coefficient here A.
Sir, could you
What,
please
delta beta?
explain the motivation for this term?
Motivation? I am just writing down a term which respects general coordinate invariance. Okay. See this,
So it should be new because index is not matching that delta.
yeah, index is not matching, that is true. So where somewhere
Delta should be
Basically, in the other
delta should be new. Yeah.
or
Meaning the point, okay, we somehow missed out the index somewhere here, right? Because after doing this, we arrived at this G delta, the free index was delta. So here, in fact, on this side, the index should have been delta.
yes, that's the thing.
same.
Because same. But the point is that I'm trying to write it in a form that we arrived at. Okay. So the motivation for this is simply that this is one of the terms that you can write down without any conflict with general coordinate invariance, right? But it violates principle of equivalence, right? Because if this term is there, then even in the local inertial frame where this is 0, there is this term and then there is this term. Because even in local inertial frame, Riemann tensor doesn't vanish.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is again a demonstration that general coordinate invariance does not necessarily require that you have to satisfy principle of equivalence. Right? Principle of equivalence is a useful principle to arrive at the correct equations to a very good accuracy. Okay? But you should keep in mind that it's not a sacred principle. The sacred principle is that you have to maintain general coordinate invariance. that both sides transforms here, this side transforms in a certain way, and you can easily check that this side transforms exactly in the same way, right? That's the way you derive the transformation of f beta gamma in the first place. So adding a term like this is perfectly consistent with principle of equivalence. At the same time, you see again that this term has two more derivatives compared to this term. F of course has one derivative, both contains a single factor of f. Right? Here, that's the only possible only derivative term, right? Here, on the other hand, R contains two derivatives. So this coefficient A should have a dimension of length square. And the natural quantity that will appear here, either because of quantum gravity corrections or stringy corrections, is something like 10 to the minus 33 centimeter square times a numerical factor of order 1. And because of the small size that appears here, for all everyday purpose, we can just ignore such terms. Okay, and that's what explains why principle of equivalence works so well. Okay, it's not that the principle of equivalence is a sacred principle, okay, but nevertheless, we can justify use of principle of equivalence simply by noting that anything that violates principle of equivalence always comes with additional derivatives, and those mean that the corresponding coefficient will have a very small number in front.
Respecting the principle of equivalence comes because the degree to which your local inertial is defined depends on the precision actually to which you want to define the local inertial frame. Is that the reason?
No. The point is that the local inertial frame, you can define local inertial frame, but in that you can get rid of gamma. If the equations of motion has terms involving the Christoffel symbol, those you can set to 0 and make the equations look identical to the equation in flat space. However, there can be corrections. Because principle of equivalence, okay, even though we use it as a principle to arrive at various equations, I mean, it's not a symmetry principle, right? And typically in physics, anything that is consistent with certain symmetries is always allowed. So adding such a term in the equations of motion of a point particle is certainly allowed. It doesn't violate any symmetry principle, okay, and it is in fact there. I mean, you can check that in quantum gravity, right, or any extension of gravity like string theory, these terms appear automatically. Okay. And this doesn't mean that the principle of equivalence is not valid at ordinary scales. Right? For all ordinary experiments that you can do in gravity, such terms are so small that their effect can be ignored. But as a general principle, right, if you want to know if principle of equivalence holds to arbitrary accuracy, that is not in general true. And you can imagine a world, okay, in which principle of equivalence can be violated by large amount without violating any sacred principle like general coordinate invariance. Okay. There could be a world in which this coefficient, instead of being 10 to the minus 33 centimeter square, was large. Okay, and in such a world, you will not have principle of equivalence, but nevertheless you can have general coordinate invariance.
Sir, the transformation rule for f you got from the principle of equivalence.
That's right, yes.
And now you are somehow building up from those tensor fields, just treating them as a tensor fields and working them.
Exactly, yeah. So the point is that now you can go in the opposite way. So it is true that you ignore certain set of terms to find the transformation laws, right? And now one way at least to build up corrections respecting the transformation laws is by saying that the transformation laws themselves don't change, okay, but the corrections respect the same symmetry, right, according to the same transformation law.
So then the field equations also.
You could try, for example, modify the transformation laws themselves. Okay, that will be much more complicated, okay, and typically after some redefinition it may again come back to the same thing. Okay, that depends on the details. Okay. But the idea is that you derive the transformation laws using principle of equivalence, and then you say that okay, those transformation laws will keep intact, right? Because those look like nice tensorial transformations, right? Homogeneous transformation laws, and then you find all possible corrections consistent with those transformation laws.
So sir, but this means that since you have started from the principle of equivalence,
Yes.
so it means that that your f beta gamma, the field tensor, is actually like an object which you have built it up, right? And
Yes.
now you are using such an object which obeys an principle of equivalence and kind of things like which you are allowed in your first in your theory, and then you have removed it from your theory.
That's true. Yes.
So won't it give you some more correction terms and all in f beta gamma, because probably now a general transformation won't follow.
Yeah. So
beta
this
gamma.
now means that if you really want to define f beta gamma, right? We cannot use the earlier principle that we have, where we said that in the local inertial frame, the laws are exactly that of the laws in the absence of gravity, right? Because these will act as corrections, right? So now you have to define. So you cannot define f alpha beta that way, right? But now you simply have to regard f alpha beta as a vector field or a tensor field and work with that, right? In the local inertial frame. So once you know the laws, right? In the local inertial frame, the force is given by this plus this. Right? This is a correction. So you measure the force in local inertial frame and you can still define f alpha beta, okay? But after taking this correction into account, right? Because you know what R is. Right? Imagine that you know the curvature of your space. Right? Then while it is true that the laws are not exactly the same as the laws that you will expect in the absence of gravity, you know what the modified laws are. So you can still measure f alpha beta by going to local inertial frame and taking into account these modifications.
Okay.
Right? But what I am saying is that this is, you can certainly ask that since I derived the transformation laws of f alpha beta using principle of equivalence, at least I motivated, okay, by using principle of equivalence. While trying to generalize, we could have even tried to change the transformation laws of f. That's certainly a possibility, right? That you make other kinds of modifications when the electromagnetic field transforms differently. Right? But of course, in appropriate limit, it should go back to the original transformation law. Right? That way, you may either get a more general set of corrections, right? Or you may find that it may look like something that which is more general, but in terms of these new A's, right, that the two sets of A's, suppose we have an equation like this and we have another set of equations involving A tilde which transforms differently, which has different set of terms, there may still be some redefinition of fields which takes you from A to A tilde, in which case you are not gaining anything by allowing the transformation laws of A to change. Yeah? So both possibilities exist, right? Whether you can get something by allowing for more general transformation laws is not something you can obviously settle at this stage. Right? You may get a more general class of theories by allowing it to transform more generally. Okay, but the simplest possible ways to extending it, okay, is that you assume that the transformation laws of A do not change. Okay. What changes is the extra terms, okay, and those extra terms are built so that the symmetries remain symmetries of this with the transformation laws of A that you have already found earlier. Any other questions? So this is a particular way of extending the theory without violating the general coordinate transformation. That you don't try to change the transformation laws of A, because once you have a tensor transformation laws, right, you don't want to give it up. Right? You keep the tensor transformation laws and then try to add more terms which are consistent with those transformation laws.